In this video, I will very briefly discuss the history of the family in the United States. This week's lesson will have a link to a video that will go much more in depth into this topic. Early on in the United States, marriage really wasn't about romantic love as we think of it today. Rather, it was about property and power and how families could expand their labor force. Children were seen as a way to bring more free labor to the farm. Also, families thought about how to gain well-connected in-laws, seal business deals, and things that really were very far from some of the reasons we think about today when we choose our partners. Also, the youngest child in the family might have been discouraged from marrying at all early on in the U.S. because that would mean the inheritance that would go to the siblings would be less, and also that youngest child would have been expected to stay and take care of aging parents, especially aging mothers after the father passed away. And as you probably have heard, servants, slaves, and the very poor were forbidden from marrying. This was for a variety of reasons. In the system of slavery, marriage was not allowed because it was seen as a way to give power to people, and because it was seen as somewhat easier to control people if they didn't have links to others in their community, like a spouse or a child. Of course, people did form partnerships and relationships and have children. Those would have just been seen as something outside of the law. As far as forbidding the very poor from marrying, that was seen as a way to prevent them from having children, and thus a possible way to shrink the numbers of the very poor and those who were unable to care for their children. The solution wasn't necessarily to help them with their children, but just to prevent them from marrying so they didn't have children, which of course didn't work very well either. In the 1800s, we have the Industrial Revolution. During this time, the middle-class men went to factories. They weren't working in the fields. Wages rose and people moved to cities for their employment, and so we saw a real shift, a corresponding shift in the families during this time as well, because women were not expected to work alongside their husbands in the fields. Things became a little bit different in the family systems. And so love, not money, for the first time became the reason for getting married, because women weren't needed around the farm, and you didn't necessarily choose your wife because she would be good stock to build, to breed hardy children who could help around the farm. And so this shift to love being the focus of marriage was somewhat controversial among more conservative people. Conservative people at this time wanted to maintain what up until that point had been the traditional family value of marrying for money and marrying to keep the community moving smoothly, and that was done by arranging marriages that helped expand the labor force and didn't necessarily revolve around romantic love. And so also people worried that if people were allowed to marry because of love, if they were no longer in love, what would happen? And so, of course, eventually down the line in our history, we see what does happen, and that when people have choices, it does affect the stability of the family. Many people think that trade-off is worth it. Child labor was cheap during the Industrial Revolution and helped build the economy. It was very common for children to work long hours in the factory, and they weren't needed around the farm anymore, so we shifted them to the factories to work. And children at this time weren't necessarily in the classroom if they were needed in the factory. And so this change put women in an interesting spot. We were no longer needed to be working alongside the men in the fields, but women hadn't quite yet achieved equality that would allow them to be out there in the workforce with the men. And so what we saw here was a bit of confusion about roles, and so this cult of domesticity and true womanhood was seen kind of as a backlash against the times. And socially, there was a lot of pressure on women to get their value from being very pious and pure, submissive to their husbands, and their role as a good domestic within the household was what made them the most valued. And so women sometimes resisted this, but there was a tremendous amount of social pressure for this, and we will see this at another period in our history as well. Stay tuned. And so in the 1920s, we had some cases against child labor, and child labor was abolished. So then we saw another shift here. Children were back in the homes, or not in the factories. They were in the homes and then in school, of course. And so for the very first time in the history of the United States, women working outside of the home and women at home with the children was the norm. We often talk about this as the traditional model, but really we didn't see it for the first time until the 1920s. It hit its peak in the 1950s, as we'll talk about in a couple minutes here. But up until this point, it really was not the most common. We always had women outside of the home working or on the farm working alongside the men. And so of course during the 1920s, we saw children in schools not working in the factories, so that was a major shift for children as well. So you're probably noticing that as social and political events happen, it affects the family and kind of affects the shape of the family. The 1940s were no exception. In the 40s, of course, we had World War II. While the men were off fighting the war, women were needed in the factories. And so this became a massive shift in women's roles in the community and within the family, because women went to work and they did it. And they had a taste of freedom, and they were out there earning their own money, and they began to see themselves as more than housewives, as more than mothers. And certainly those things were still valued, but in addition they started to see themselves as capable of contributing in the community in similar ways that men had been doing up until that point. And so that was a massive change for women. And then the war ended. And so then we have the 1950s. And so once the men returned from war, the women weren't needed in the factories, but they had gotten that taste of freedom, and they didn't necessarily want to go back into the home. And so if they were going to be forced back into the home and give up their newfound freedom, they demanded new technology to make their jobs easier. So during the 1950s, we really see a vast increase in home appliances such as washing machines and vacuum cleaners that made women's work a little bit easier in the home. And so the 1950s, post-World War II, was the height of the man as the breadwinner and the woman at home with the children in the 1950s. And so sometimes we think, again, as this being the typical family structure that's been through all of history, but that just isn't accurate, really. We see a backlash again during this period. Two things happening at once. On one hand, there are women who are back in the home, but they're kind of uneasy with this role, and they're demanding some support, they're demanding assistance, and they don't necessarily want to be forced back into the home. And so at the same time, we see the social backlash, this cult of domesticity and true womanhood. And just like in the earlier period in the 1920s, or excuse me, during the Industrial Revolution, this was really about pressuring women to accept their role as a housewife and as a mother, and to not think beyond that, because thinking beyond that could possibly upset the social fabric. And so while women were being kind of forced to stay in the home, and they weren't happy. And so one thing we do see in the 1950s is widespread overuse of psychiatric medications among women at home. And you may have heard the term mommy's little helper, and that was a term that was given to psychiatric pills that women took on a large scale in the 1950s because they were not actually really happy being June Cleaver. And of course, many were, but as a group, women were really starting to want more, to demand more, or at least to have choices for more. And so the 1960s came, and really we started to see that kind of come to fruition. And so Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique at this time, and that was truly groundbreaking and influential, and it really challenged the idea that women could just be made whole if they found the right man and became the perfect wife and mother. And it really did start to challenge this notion that that's all women could be. And so it didn't necessarily diminish the significance of those roles, but it really did try to open the door to give women choices to choose what roles made sense for them. And like we've talked about earlier, we saw a backlash. A year later, a year after this, when people were really starting to talk about these things, an article in the American Medical Association described beating as a more or less satisfactory way for an aggressive, efficient, masculine wife to be punished for castrating activity and for a husband to reestablish his masculine identity. And so this was not in some fringe publication. This was the American Medical Association encouraging husbands to beat their wives to make them more feminine and make sure they stayed in their place. And so, you know, of course, we know what direction the 1960s took. In the 1960s and 1970s, we have the Civil Rights Movement. This was really also an important time because this was the introduction of the birth control pill, which really changed things for women. It allowed women to have the power to limit their family sizes, and being able to limit the size of one's family gave women a power that we've never had in the past. And in much larger numbers than ever before, we saw women in higher education. And so with these freedoms and this access, we started to see that women have choices, and when women have true choices, they tend to have higher standards. And so as a result of this, we did see a delay in the marriage age. If women don't simply define themselves by their relationship with their husband and instead want to receive an education and want to pursue other interests before getting married, we will see a delay in the marriage age. The childbearing age went up. When women could control this, they did, and they realized there were many things they wanted to do before they started having children. Also, divorce rates went up. Previously, women were really kind of viewed as a sort of property of their husbands, and there weren't choices. And if your husband beat you, and if your husband cheated, and if your husband went out and drank up all the money, well, you just be a good wife and you smile and you deal with it. And so when women started having options, we did see the divorce rates going up. Another thing that happened, those domestic violence rates went down when women didn't have to stay and just put up with violence. We saw a decrease in it. And of course, around this time, we started talking more about domestic violence. And so talking about any social problem helps us deal with it more effectively. And then, of course, from the 1970s, we transitioned into our more modern era. And so for today's family, we will talk more about this in this week's lesson. We'll have some statistics, some information about myths about today's families, but this will just serve as a very brief history, kind of hitting the highlights of what families have been like through the history of the U.S.